So I want to start here at the beginning. And at the beginning, I mean, as people are entering their careers in software development. So how do people enter a career as a doctor? Not true of everybody, but a lot of physicians still take the Hippocratic Oath. This is a modern version. It's from like 1964, but the Hippocratic Oath is one of the oldest binding documents in human history. And what it says essentially is that I'm treating a patient, a human being, not a disease, that I'm responsible for the health and the outcome of my patient. On a strangely related note, if you want to get a job in construction, the very first thing that you're going to get is instructions on human safety. I was actually driving up to CodeMash, and I was behind an 18-wheeler on the, this two-lane divided road, and it said, safety first on the back of the 18-wheeler. Okay? How do we get started in software development? The strange thing is, as a developer, I like the other ones better. I think they've maybe been thinking about this for a while. A couple weeks ago, I saw an interesting newspaper article, and this is actually, it's nice to see good news every once in a while. In 2017, there were no deaths in the airline transportation industry worldwide. That is amazing. But the experts quoted in the article said, we fear that we're not going to be able to keep up with this amazing record because passengers all bring laptops, and laptops tend to explode and cause fire. And I'm just thinking here, imagine saying to someone in 1968 that in 2018, the biggest threat to airline passenger safety is going to be the computing industry's disregard for human life. That's a sobering thought. So I have a question for you. If you were to start a software project and your first thought was, how do I protect human safety, what would you do differently? How would you approach things differently? This isn't just my suggestion, incidentally. I'm a member of the Association for Computing Machinery, and currently we're rewriting the Code of Ethics for the ACM. And the very first principle in the ACM's Code of Ethics is that we are responsible for protecting people, protecting human rights, and avoiding harm. So one of the things that you hear very often is that people are the problem in computer security. It's easy to look at like phishing statistics and things and say, oh, the systems would be secure if only people wouldn't give their passwords to, any random stranger who calls on the phone. Computing today, it's in a place which is really, I think, kind of similar to where we were at the start of the Industrial Revolution. We're enjoying this new productivity and we're enjoying economic benefits, but we're kind of starting to see there's a little bit of smog in the air and somebody got killed in a factory accident. And I think we're going to have to really get our ducks in a row about how we think about how the systems that we build are used by people. So first of all, just to sort of set the stage, I want to think about what security actually means. People do use the word to mean different things. And I want to say, in particular, what does security mean in the context of software? There's like cables right here, and I tend to pace a little bit, but I keep tripping over them when I do it. So security professionals and QAs actually have a fair bit in common. Same with developers. We're all concerned about the actual behavior of what software does. And some of this is going to be described by a specification. It might be a formal specification, or more commonly it's informal. It might be like a Word document or a bunch of emails that you exchange. And a QA is going to investigate, does the software correctly perform the behaviors that are in the specification, and are there any behaviors in the specification that it doesn't perform? And a really good QA is going to expand the specification as they work and sort of further refine what the software is intended to do as part of a dialogue between the architects and the developers and the business analysts. Okay? Security analysts, on the other hand, tend to be really interested in the things the software does that is not part of the specification, or areas in which the specification is maybe a little self-contradictory. And there's one other thing that security analysts and QAs tend to have in common. We tend to be adamant that security and quality is not just a little shaker that you can shake on top of a crappy piece of software at the end of the project and sort of magically sprinkle security and quality onto it. A good security professional or a QA is going to want to help you with the design of your application and try and push potential problems much earlier in the development process. So to recap a little, a QA is going to say, does the software do what it should do? And a security analyst is going to say, well, does it also do anything else? And as a developer, and I am principally a developer here, so I get to make fun of myself a lot, we have to ask, do we even know what the software is supposed to do in the first place? It's very common for developers to say, I really need more information about this. I need to understand what it is that this thing's supposed to do. So now I'm going to talk about some myths of how to build secure systems, and I'll follow it with some truths, and then we'll get a little less hand-wavy and go into some more specific methodology. Okay? So one thing it's fun to use titles like good guys and bad guys, and the trouble with this sort of thinking is that it can lead us down the road where we think it's one versus the other. And there's a quote that I really like. It's sometimes called Hanlon's razor, that says, never attribute to malfeasance that which can adequately be explained by incompetence. Which is to say that the biggest security problem you have might actually be the good guys. Okay? So we can't think of it as one side versus the other. Another thing that you hear a lot, and I hear people say this straight out, is that, as if it were some sort of maxim, is that we must always choose between security and convenience. And I really disagree with this one. Because, if I put a digital lock and a deadbolt with a key on both sides and stuff and all these locks on my door, is that increasing my security? Well, no. If it's so much trouble to get through the door that my family just leaves the door unlocked all the time, I've actually been harmful by introducing a user experience that is terrible. When we design a secure system, we want to have people fall into the pit of success. So I completely disagree with the statement here. This one, on the other hand, when I put this in the deck, I wanted to make sure that this was not some sort of straw man argument, and so I went looking for a source for this. And unfortunately, the source I found is Bruce Schneier, who knows way more about security than I ever will. So I feel a little weird throwing this up here as a myth. Having said that, I really don't think it's a truism. The notion that on the internet attack is easier than defense, it's not wrong, but it's not automatically correct. It is true that a complex system can often have a large attack surface. Doesn't necessarily have to be true. And the real point of contention I have here is that in a well-designed, secure system, it is rarely the case that a single bug means game over. Like, people do exploit Google Chrome, but they typically are chaining together 7, 8, 9 different vulnerabilities in order to do it. So I really think that putting this in such an emphatic way trivializes the thought that we need to put into our systems. Defenders do have a home turf advantage, and just empirically, there are a lot of websites that don't get hacked. Okay? So I want to bring a little bit more subtlety into the conversation than there is here. This, as I mentioned earlier, I bring it up. I think a lot of people who are aware of OWASP Top 10 and what it does and what it doesn't do, they pretty much know that there are limitations to the tool. But it is interesting because this does so often get written into contracts. We need to do something about security. OWASP Top 10 is something. Therefore, but, I want to do a little bit of a shout out to OWASP because aside from the top 10 that everybody knows, they have some other tools that are really helpful. They have cheat sheets, they have good tools, and they have something called the proactive top 10, which is just an entirely different list of things that you can do that are, whereas the OWASP top 10 are mistakes that you want to avoid making, the ProWASP top 10 are things that you actually might want to consider doing. So this is a very dangerous myth that I've heard people say directly, we don't have any secrets, what's the big deal? Well, if you're in this industry at all, what you probably do have are users. Your end users are still people, so they're still targets. You still have to think about security, even if all your data is 100% public. This is something that I really hate because every item on this list is a good idea. There are no bad ideas on this list. But if we just say that in order to build a secure system, you have to do this thing and this thing and this thing and this thing and this thing, that's the equivalent of saying, Every item is a #1 priority, therefore nothing has any priority whatsoever. And by the way, we can never hope to complete this, so we have no chance of building a secure system. So this bothers me a little bit. Okay, rant done. I want to talk to you about some things some people that I actually agree with here. Security decisions that are made without the context of an articulated threat model are specification and folklore. I'm going to elaborate on this, but when somebody says to me in the workplace, we have to do X because of security, my response is usually, could I please see your threat model so that I understand how this fits in? And the answer is usually, what's a threat model? If your reaction is also what's a threat model, there is no shame in here. I'm proud of you for coming to CodeMash, and we're going to talk about that later in the presentation. And when you walk out of here, you'll not only know what a threat model is, but also how to build one. You cannot describe a software system as secure or insecure. Building on the quote in the previous slide, you can't use the word security to justify a decision. Like, every bad password policy follows this myth. We have to do X because security. I've had my bank say, we do this because security. Okay, what's your threat model? We don't know. And here's the mundane truth. As developers, it's really fun to think about ODE, right? And reverse engineering and coming up with incredibly new exploits that target the branch prediction in the processor, and that stuff is all so cool. But the mundane truth is that most sites that get popped, it's probably either going to be phishing or somebody didn't apply updates, like the majority there, okay? Fortunately, there is a solution, it is, I think, one of the best people who articulated this is the Reverend Dr. Fred Rogers. But again, this is sort of hand-waving. I want to talk about how we can design secure systems by thinking outside the box, because that is what security analysts do, right? But we need to do something a little bit more structured. So as I said, you don't want to blindly pull in every mitigation imaginable. We don't just go into Costco and pull every blinky box off the shelf, right? We want to assemble a suite of components that build our design. What is our design going to be? As I said, we're going to base it on human security first. And that sounds good when I say I want to protect people. I hope you agree with that. But again, it's very hand-wavy. So what does this mean exactly? In most business domains, my point here is this, it's a little bit non-obvious. In most business domains, there are non-obvious risks to human safety, as well as traditional, like, security, quote-unquote, best practices that really fall flat on their face. So just an example here, it's common advice among security folks to say never click on an attachment in email, bad things will happen, okay? Every single one of you, or almost every single one of you, unless you're a sole proprietor, has someone in your organization, and they're probably in the HR department, where the essential nature of their job is opening attached Word documents and PDF files from real idiots on the internet. So to say you're not allowed to click on an attachment is equivalent to saying you're not allowed to do your job. And I hope if you say that to them, they're going to laugh at you, because you can't, as a security professional, you can't just tell people you're not allowed to work, period. So we have to think, how can I empower this person to do their job safely? Like maybe the right email client for them is an iPad or something. Is a spell checker security sensitive software? Well, it is if it automatically and silently changes your prescription when you type. This is Mac OS in the default settings, by the way. Here's some other fails. Amazon, for weeks, sold, knowingly, I have to say, sold hazardous eclipse glasses, counterfeits that didn't work and were probably harmful to human safety. Facebook actually has one of the best CISOs in the industry now, Alex Stamos. I have to believe that they are really aware of how people use their site, but they also have an incredibly difficult problem. And here we have people literally attempting to use Facebook to start riots. If that's not the definition of harm to humans, it's hard to see how it could be more extreme. You know, iTunes wasn't designed as a money laundering platform. It was intended to be a terrible music player. But people do, in fact, use it for that. And so we have to think, what are people bringing to our software? And, if you're designing a Wi-Fi enabled refrigerator, are you thinking about, is the thing that I'm building going to be used to attack people? It turns out the answer is yes. So again, I feel like I've been very hand-wavy so far, and I want to go a little bit deeper into do we have a methodical approach that we can use in order to build more secure systems? So I want to talk about building a threat model, and a threat model, well, I'll show you examples, but the basic questions that it need to answer is, what do we have, what could go wrong, and who's affected by the software? So we're going to expand on all three of these points. Well, first, let's talk about who's affected by the software. Like I said, I really do like to put people first. It turns out a lot of people are, and maybe not just the folks who click on your site. So you have to ask yourself, who are your users? Who are your customers? Hopefully we all know that users and customers are often not the same thing. Who are the employees in your organization? Who's on your team? Who are the stakeholders in your organization? Do you partner with other organizations? Who are the people in the community, the random people who are getting DDoS by your refrigerator, who might be affected by the tools that you build? A lot of people who build threat models for a living are not so good about enumerating the groups and the specific individuals who are affected by what they build. But in my mind, we do need to make a list. A little more comfortable technical turf for many of us is, what do we have? What is it that we're building? I mean, obviously there's infrastructure, but when we think of infrastructure, we sometimes think of it in like servers and networks and things, but we also have to include third parties, end user browsers, anything that's going to interact with the system. Similar story with data, right? It's easy to think about databases, but most systems also produce metadata, and one of the things that we've learned from the Snowden leaks is that metadata is often more important than data when it comes to compromising an end user. We need to think about the logs we store, about how and where we store credentials in a system, and especially we need to think about where, other than machines we directly own, where are we storing data? I mean, there can be browser local storage, there can be client caches, there can be, content distribution networks. If I have leaked somebody's credentials and I want to make sure that we address all the places those could show up, there's a dizzying amount of places I need to look, and it helps if I start a project by enumerating these things. Also, very important to consider are trust boundaries. It's easy to think about explicit trust boundaries, things like a network partition, but there are also implicit trust boundaries that maybe just, on Mondays I have one role at my job, and on Tuesdays I have different roles in my jobs. And there's a trust boundary there that really exists maybe only in my mind. Third question, who might attack it? What could possibly go wrong? I mean, we love to think about, APTs from China and stuff, but the mundane truth is that I'm a lot more concerned about domain-specific risks. As I said, I want to take care of people first. How do you do that? One way is to learn from history. This is the Maginot Line here. We want to talk to business analysts, red team members about past experience they've had. I'll give an example later on when we do a work through example of applying the fundamental principles of application security. It's also sort of interesting to think, what would the existential threats be? In 2012, a software bug caused Knight Capital's high-speed trading system to issue millions of bad trades over 45 minutes. It cost the company $440 million. Which they sued and said we shouldn't be responsible for, and they lost, and it effectively ended their business. How many people here are familiar with the GDPR? Okay, I see maybe a quarter or third of the hands come up. In this room, immediately after this presentation is going to be a presentation, and I know like sponsor sessions, you sometimes think, I'll go get a drink instead. But there's going to be a sponsor session about law of software, and the GDPR is explicitly something he said he'd cover. Unless you can prove that no European is ever going to use the software you design, I strongly recommend you inform yourself. One way is to just stay in your chair when the session's done. Another way, you can go read. There's some good articles about it. One of the provisions of the GDPR that a lot of people have heard about is the right to be forgotten, the so-called right to be forgotten. The simple explanation of that is that if a European citizen calls you and says, I would like you to remove my personal data from my site, within reason, you're obligated to do so. Okay, that sounds maybe like something I might want as an individual, but as an engineer, if I'm designing, you know, an event source system or a CQRS system, you know, and I'm storing all this data that later on I'm aggregating into a relational database that I use for my queries, it's suddenly like, unless I'm thinking about these regulations, and they are regulations, when I design my system, I might be in a little bit of trouble if I try and sort of slap this in after the fact. Okay, so I really want to start bringing this down to earth. First, I'm going to talk about the information security practice principles. This is from mostly the work of Susan Stuntz, although she has two co-authors here, Craig Jackson and Scott Russell, at the Center for Applied Cybersecurity Research at Indiana University. Despite the use of the word cyber in the title of the institution, they've done a great job here. And the general thrust of this is there are a lot of areas in security where reasonable best practices exist, where we know how to parameterize our queries and we know how to use like good parsers and things like that. But, you know, we are in a fast-moving industry. Our business requirements change every day. Technology changes every day. And they started to really think hard about how is it that we can apply, how can we design secure systems in areas that didn't exist last week? Are there fundamentals here that we can use in order to have a good security practice in places where best practices don't exist? And they did a lot of research into how things have been secured for hundreds of years, not just in the digital domain. Their book is, I don't know, 60, 70 pages. I really recommend reading it. It's a lot of good information in a very short presentation. I do have some more information on the book in the end, at the end of the slideshow. It's also free. You can get it from their website as a PDF. Strongly recommend, if what I say to you is interesting at all, that this is really the place to go. Anyway, they have distilled the idea of building a secure system down to 7 principles. I'm going to run through the 7 principles, and then to try and bring it even a little bit more down to earth, I'm going to take a problem that I worked on for a client, and we're going to apply those 7 principles and say, how does that inform the security decisions we make? Any questions? I'm about halfway through here, so before we go on, any questions at this point? Okay, awesome. The only problem with these principles is some of them are a little bit of a mouthful. The first is comprehensivity, which is a word unknown to my spell checker. But the principle of comprehensivity says that we need to identify and account for all relevant systems, actors, and risks in the environment. And this sounds a little bit like building a threat model, and it can indeed contribute to a threat model, but it's actually a little bit bigger than that. We're not just thinking about systems, but we're also thinking about, are we addressing things over time? Are we talking about training our staff members? The second principle is opportunity. Opportunity says take advantage of the actor relationships, material resources, and strategic opportunities available in the environment. Third principle is rigor. What is the correct behavior? How am I enforcing it? Specify and enforce the expected states, behaviors, and processes governing the relevant systems and actors. It's 2 phases, specification and enforcement. I am a computer science nerd who loves formal specification. This one is really something that I enjoy. Number 4, minimization. Minimize the size, quantity, and complexity of what's to be protected. Limit externally facing points of attack. We want to minimize time as well. Delete data, remove unused code. Fifth principle, compartmentalization. Totally isolate system elements, then enable and control the interactions essential for their intended purposes. We often think of this in terms of network partitioning. It sounds a lot like configuring firewall rules. Like, First you turn off everything, then you open the ports you need, and you maybe monitor the traffic going through here. First of all, network partitioning is leaky. And second, we can also compartmentalize on things like identity or elevation of privilege, and we'll go into some examples in a moment. The sixth principle is fault tolerance. Anticipate and address the potential compromise and failure of system elements and security controls. Seventh and last principle, proportionality. Tailor your security strategies to the degree of risk, accounting for the practical constraints imposed by the use case and the environment. So the interesting thing about these is that it's not a checklist. You don't go through, check off comprehensivity and move on to the second principle. One of the things that you may notice right away is that many of these principles work against each other. The notion of proportionality works against comprehensivity. Proportionality says, address the things that are important, don't bother with the things that are not important. All of these principles trade off against each other. So they're interesting considerations, but maybe it's, a lot of them, are not actually mentioning specific technologies. So how do we apply these to software architecture? How can we decide when we're done? What I'd like to do here is work through a problem that I worked on with a real client. I've changed a lot of things about this, and partially it's in order to anonymize the folks involved. But the real reason that I changed this is that the particular client had some very specific things in their infrastructure that are just not going to be well known to folks here. So I'm using AWS as an example because I think that's something that a lot of people are familiar with. So imagine that we're going to build on AWS, and the business problem here is this. There's a hotel chain that needs to capture credit card numbers for incidental charges, but maybe the card won't be present at check-in. So, for example, I'm sure that all of your employers have agreed to cover your incidentals here at the Kalahari. And, you may not have the business credit card, but they're definitely going to pay for your room service, right? Is that true? Okay. But maybe more practically, like you might have a kid on a sports team and they're staying in a hotel and you don't have with them. You would like to authorize, basically make it so that they can check into their room. Hopefully they're tasteful in their choice of television programming. You won't be present at check-in, so we need to be able to authorize the card ahead of time. And the way that the hotel used to do this is that the parent would print out a paper form from the website, write down all their credit card information in the CVV2, and they would fax this to the hotel where the general manager would put it in a folder somewhere and hopefully keep track of it. Obviously there are problems with the current system, which is why the hotel wants to update. They'd like an online system to do this. I think it's pretty obvious that there are some risks involved in implementing the system, and maybe you folks are smart people who come to CodeMash and you have some ideas on how to engineer this. But what if we didn't know that? Like, what if we had no experience with this? How would we go about building a system? Well, one way that I think is actually not a terrible way to start is to come up with a really naive solution. Like, let's get her done. So there's no shame in starting with a naive solution, actually, as long as you don't end there. So basically here we have a web application, and the actors involved are the hotel manager and the card holder, and then we store the data in a database. And we're using HTTPS because we care about security. You might see some potential problems here, but like I said, you folks probably already know something a little bit about security. What I'd really like to think about is can we apply a systematic method to coming up with a better design? So let's apply the first of the 7 principles, which is comprehensivity. First of all, like even before we get into the business problem domain, the first diagram I put together was frankly oversimplified because most human beings don't talk to web servers directly. They do it through browsers. Similarly, the hotel manager is probably using a point-of-sale application. I said before that we're going to host on AWS, so I need to draw the trust boundaries around there. And there's some specifics of AWS that need to go in my diagram. So let's be clear. At this point, I have done nothing about security. From a security point of view, these two diagrams are more or less equivalent. But I just want to enumerate everything I have here. And one thing that you may wonder is, how am I producing these diagrams? And you're especially going to wonder that when I show you some additional features of the tool later on in the show. This is a tool called Microsoft Threat Modeling Tool 2016. It's a free tool from Microsoft. The only really serious limitation is it only works on Windows. But I strongly recommend this tool. It's the best thing going right now. There is an OWASP project called, I think, Threat Dragon, that they want to build a cross-platform threat modeling tool, but it is in the super, super early stages at the moment. So either like live with the fact that you have to run this on Windows, or maybe go start contributing to the OWASP tool. Okay, so let's really try and apply the principle of comprehensivity. And one way to do that is to talk with a domain expert. So you might presume that the biggest risk to the system is theft of credit card numbers, but the hotel actually has a lot of experience in their industry, and it hasn't been a problem for them. The thing that they're really concerned about is carders like to exchange databases of previously stolen credit card numbers, and the hotel has noticed that people type those numbers into their systems as a way of validating that the cards are still okay and haven't been canceled by their rightful owners. Pardon me. So that's actually their number one threat. So we're going to add that to the diagram, and we're going to make the carders an explicit actor in here. And they don't actually access our site through a browser. They use an attack proxy. The domain expert also points out that there are additional actors missing from the threat model, so we're going to add them in. They're not connected to anything at this point. It's not clear just how they fit in, but we'll at least include them to make sure that we don't forget them, and so on and so on. We're going to do a lot of discovery with people who know the business domain and the technical domain very well. It's important to remember that the principle of comprehensivity requires not just identifying the actors and the risks, but accounting for them. And this is another feature of the threat modeling tool. Once I've made that diagram, I can flip over to the analysis view. This is not a list of things that are on the diagram. This is a list of risks that are associated with connecting any two elements in the diagram, and it produces this automatically, although I can change the automatically generated risks. It also has some features I'm going to show you in a little bit that allow me to categorize and edit these risks, and then to say which of the risks have been mitigated, which of the things I've determined are not an issue, and so on and so forth. We're not done until we account for all the risks, but I'm going to move on to the second principle here. And the reason is that as I go through the 7 principles, I'm going to identify additional things that fall under the comprehensivity umbrella. Remember, these things do build on each other. So I'm not required to get done, despite the name, I'm not required to get done with comprehensivity before I move on. But there's a couple other things I want to mention under this umbrella that are not just like infrastructure concerns. One of them is CI. I think it's really important to have a practice of security checks in your continuous integration. It doesn't even matter really what the specific thing that you check is. It just needs to be in your thought space, as we care about security in the context of continuous integration. So one place that I think this really pays off is on vulnerable dependencies. You may not depend on any vulnerable components today. You might have done the analysis and looked at everything that you're pulling in and said, yeah, we're fine. But when you update your dependencies tomorrow, something could get transitively included and pulled in via NPM or whatever that is in fact vulnerable. So I think that the only way you can really keep a handle on this is to do it automatically. One tool that does this pretty well is OWASP dependency check. Also, GitHub has a feature for this now. It's something you can turn on in your GitHub settings that allows you to flag any components you depend on that have CVEs. It turns out that the hotel also has some security infrastructure, including continuous monitoring, which we're going to consider in a moment. But I want to bring this up now in order to emphasize that the principle of comprehensivity means comprehensivity over time as well as space. We need to consider future interactions with the systems that we build. Another thing that falls under the comprehensivity umbrella is training. We need to pick the right kind of training for our team. We often think about training in terms of like certifications in the OWASP top 10 and whatnot. But maybe like the thing that's important to to communicate with your team are the business-specific assumptions and experiences and risks that only you know about. Training does tend to take a lot of team time, and you need to be sure that you're training on the right things. For the opportunity principle, there are a few things that we can consider. One are the actor relationships. There are a few that fall in the diagram and some that don't. The hotel has existing infrastructure, and so does AWS. The hotel is also, they don't want to store credit cards, so they're using a third-party tokenization service that needs to be in our plan. We also need to consider information sharing with other people in the same industry. There are often organizations that are dedicated to industry-specific threat intelligence. Another thing, the second part of opportunity is material resources. So AWS and others have best practices white papers that you can follow. We want to use managed services instead of maintaining our own bare metal. This is also the place in which, checklists of best practices like the OWASP Top 10 do fall in. And then finally, strategic opportunities. We want to work with the business users to help the end users fall into the pit of success. In particular, the business analyst was concerned with designing a process that didn't require the end user, the cardholder, to create a login with a password that they would have to write down somewhere or reuse on Facebook or something. And there's obviously a lot more that we could do, right? I'm limited in the amount of things that I could present at the end of the talk. But moving on to the principle of rigor, I'm going to actually depart from the threat model for a second. And the reason is that the threat model is in service of the principles to build a secure application. We don't use the principles to build a threat model. It's more the other way around. So there's two steps to rigor, which are specification and enforcement. You can specify with different degrees of formality. So a sequence diagram like what you see on the screen, it's a little more formal than like a Word document, and it's a little less formal than like a modeling language like TLA+. If you do have a formal specification, you get to have all kinds of computer science fun because you can use model checkers in order to make sure it's self-consistent. You can use special compilers to make sure that your code correctly implements the spec. And if you're into that sort of thing, you gotta have dinner with me because I really like that stuff. But the second part is having come up with a good specification, we need to enforce the spec. And one good place to start is your language's type system. Make incorrect state impossible to construct. Another good way to enforce rigor is static analysis. The really cool thing about static analysis is it's essentially free. I see people who say, well, I tried to use find bugs or whatever and came up with 300 issues. I just don't have time to wade through that. I'll make it really easy for you. Like, turn on your static analyzer, do a quick look to see if anything is on fire. If it's on fire, you already have a problem that you need to fix. If stuff ain't on fire, then just suppress all of it. Now, that sounds crazy. Like, why would I suppress 300 issues? Because from that point forward, with every commit, you get that analysis forever for free. It is so easy. And you can go back and look at those things you suppress later if you want to. But static analysis is way too important to like not do just because like it seems like imposing to turn the thing on in the first place. I want to depart from the principles for a second here and just take a look back, see where we started and where we came from. Like we started with this like super naive system on the top, right? And now we have this thing on the bottom which has all this like cool security controls, and this looks like a much better design, I think. Look at all those features. More is better, right? The principle of minimization applies in many ways to our project. We want to minimize the attack surface. Obviously, we want to put servers behind firewalls. We want to use a web application firewall to make sure that, if someone's trying to DDoS us, that we can block them. We want to, block SSH into our private networks, except maybe via a jump server from known IPs, so on and so forth. But there are other ways that we can minimize the application. Like one really cool one is to remove user interfaces. If there's a user interface that is rarely or never used, if there's a feature on a UI that's almost never used, well, you're just making your QA's life harder and you're just giving another vector for the attackers. A really cool way to remove security threats from an application is to delete code you wrote. That's something I do a lot. And generally want to minimize everything. One thing that we really would like to minimize is the data we store, which is not just a good idea. It might be regulatorily required. It might be like, you know, if you're covered by PCI, you might actually be required to do this. The funny thing about databases that we use is that the default behavior of databases is to store stuff forever, except MongoDB. But it might be the case that what we really want is we need someone's information for a couple weeks or 6 months or something after that, and after that point we can either delete it altogether or we can put it in encrypted cold storage. Like, if somebody gets into our system, let's not make stuff easy for them. You know, let's make it at least a little difficult to go find, you know, the 20 years of history your company has. Compartmentalization has 3 steps. We need to totally isolate every element on the system. We need to enable the specific interactions that are needed, and then we need to control those enabled interactions. A really good place to start when you're thinking about compartmentalization and you're looking at threat models is to look for any place where a data flow crosses pardon me. Any place where a data flow crosses a trust boundary. The funny thing about compartmentalization is it's a double-edged sword. In the past, the way people thought about compartmentalization is we have the internet, which is a wild west. It's filled with all kinds of terrible people. And then we have our DMZ, which is maybe a little okay, and then we have the safety of our intranet. Well, I already said that, like, a lot of the systems that get compromised are phished. So the bad guys are probably inside your intranet anyway. The point of the compartmentalization in terms of network partitioning is not to say there's a safe place where the bad guys will never be. It's to make lateral movement more difficult. Unfortunately, this applies to us as well. If I'm monitoring one part of a network, I probably need a distinct monitor for the different part of the network. But compartmentalization is not only about network perimeters. One way to think about it is in terms of least privilege. If I'm building on AWS, I want to have IAM roles that only allow the systems that I'm building to do exactly what they need to do and nothing else. One of the things that I found in a client system is that the system was running using the developer's access token, and so it had full admin rights to the entire AWS, which not a good solution, not a good system, which has since been fixed. So applying all of these things, there are a bunch of decisions I can make. Now, I will say that the notion of compartmentalism is often done in a way that is not human-centric. It's been me, super smart developer, don't trust you, unwashed user, to do things. I'm going to restrict you, restrict you, restrict you. Like every time I use Jira, I feel this way. But I think you can do it in a really empathetic way. And you can do it in a way to say, I am building a system where you can feel free to do what you want because the system is configured so that it doesn't just explode if you touch the wrong button. So the items on the screen are some decisions that we might make, but again, there are many others that we might arrive at if we drill down a little bit more deeply. So the principle of fault tolerance is something that we have to consider for every point in the system. I'm going to give exactly one example here, and it's the case of compromised credentials. And I'm specifically using compromised credentials because it is not a technical fault. And when we think about fault tolerance, I think being gearheads, our brains automatically go to technical faults. And there's some justification for this, right? There's an academic study of severe failures in services and what are the things that brought down entire well-known services. And it's usually not a bug in the system. It's a bug in the system that caused the logging system to go bananas that brought down everything else. It's the error path that we don't tend to test when we're testing the happy path. Okay, but let's think about the case of compromised credentials, because that's just a different kind of fault. Typical response to compromised credentials is free credit monitoring, which I guess lets the execs keep their bonuses that year. But what should we do in that case? Obviously, immediately we want to stop the exfiltration, even if it means shutting down the service altogether. We need to assess the scope of the damage and find a way to limit further damage to the users. And then we need to be in contact with the users. We need to be talking to them and listening to them and finding out what steps, and it's going to be different on every incident, finding out what steps are necessary in order to make things right for them. Probably at this point we need to go ahead and engage digital forensics and incident response professionals to really find out for sure how it happened and how to prevent it happening in the future. It might be something like putting in an HSM for automatic key rotation or something like that. But we need to, at that point, we need, if we've been compromised and people have been hurt, we need to be spending the money to get professional help. Having gotten this far, what we have is a really extensive list of risks. We want to spend some time, make sure that we're taking on the appropriate issues. So I showed you the list of risks that the threat modeling tool came up with before, and every item in that list is a record here where we can go in. We can change the title if the inferred title is wrong. We can change the description to add our knowledge of what really the risk is here. And then we need to start thinking about prioritizing things. The things that could harm human health, they're the highest priority. The things that are technical flaws, we might rate those as medium. And the things that we're not sure if they're a risk or not, they're going to probably stay where they are. The things we're positive that are not a risk, we can mark them low. And every issue has a status as well. The default status is not started, but we can also say, I am sure that this automatically generated risk does not apply to our system, it's not applicable, or we can say it needs investigation, or we can make a ticket for it, and when the ticket's implemented and we've mitigated the risk, we can change the status to mitigated. And then repeat. Because the principles do interact, you can't just go through them once and have a finished application design. The absolute bare minimum to go through the 7 principles is twice in order to make sure that you get all the interactions. But you should probably plan on more. And one thing that, when I describe this, it might sound like the big design up front. And you can indeed do it that way, but I actually think this works better in an agile process. And it's specifically because it's not a checklist. It's because these principles interact with each other. If on every iteration you go through the list of the 7 principles and say, how has our product scope changed since the last iteration? How has our business understanding changed since the last iteration? How's my personal knowledge increased since the last iteration? Hopefully it's a whole lot since you're here at CodeMash. What have I learned in that time? And go through it every iteration and say, how has my threat understanding changed? What have I learned about the human users who use my system? So here's a couple different places that you can look if you'd like to know more. These are the 2 principal sources for this talk, although if you've seen the list of quotes at the start of the deck, I obviously have been doing a lot more reading. But these are the 2 that I would recommend. The first one, I think, I'm close to say that nearly everybody who builds software systems and cares about security at all really should read. It's just too much good information in a short space to overlook. The second one is a little bit harder to recommend. It's like 600 pages, and it has quite a bit of good information in it. I don't know a better reference for threat modeling. The real problem with it, aside from sheer length, is that it's about 10 years old, which is not really a problem by itself because the notion of threat modeling hasn't changed too much. But it has a lot of links to references, and there's a card game that's supposed to go with the book that doesn't seem to exist anymore, and it doesn't take into account some of the newer tooling. So I really wish there would be a second edition of this one. But these 2 references, and especially the first, are probably the best further reading if you'd like to. I want to give some credit to the stock photography used here. And the folks who organized CodeMash have asked me to ask you to please go into the app for the conference and tell me what you think about the talk. If it crashes when you open it again, and hopefully it works the second time. So there's a session survey link here. In order to see this link, you have to be logged in, which you don't actually need an account for. It's not like a username and password, but you have to click a link in your email after you install the app. And then just go into this session, find the session survey. It's just like a 1 through 5 stars and a place. If you give me comments there, I'm told that I'll be able to access them after the conference is done. This is the first conference that I've given this talk at. I obviously do rehearse, but this is the first time I've given it at a professional conference. So I really am interested in your feedback. I'd really like to hear what have I missed, what could I do better, and anything that you got out of it, I'd appreciate. If you'd rather just reach out to me personally, that's an option too. A few different ways you can do it here. I also have some Dead Tree business cards on the podium here. Thank you very, very much for coming out. I really appreciate you choosing to come to the session. If you do have any questions, we can talk about it right now, or you can come up to the podium afterwards. And like I said, if you're at all interested in the GDPR, it looks like there's going to be a sponsor session that's going to cover that pretty heavily in here. So thanks a lot.